thank you all for coming to the lecture. You've already clapped, so I guess we can. You're done. We can just be out of here. You can be done with it. Thanks everybody for coming out. It's the last lecture of the year. I'm a graduate of Duke University. And you know, it's only Tuesday. They've already won a national title, and Bjarke Ingels is here tonight. No, we're really happy to have Bjarke here. There's very little I can do to introduce him. You probably know a lot more about him than I know already. I will just say, for those who don't remember or don't know, Bjarke started out with a incredible practice with the best name of an office besides BIG, I guess, that I've ever really encountered. Plot. What an incredible title. Also, it's a kind of a device, I think, for the way a number of practices in Europe, I think, operated, narrative-based, story-based, particularly OMA. I mean, if you all will remember, Koolhaas became a really, really important intellectual and architectural figure because there's a book, Delirious in New York, that he wrote before he did very many buildings. There's a real way, I think, in which, Bjarke started a practice in 2001 with Julian Schmidt called Plot, and then built a couple of really exciting buildings and made some small product design things and did some other things, and then founded BIG in 2005 and has really not stopped since. There's a real way in which, in my view, the exciting things that were happening in Holland, and I spent a lot of time in Holland in the middle to late 1990s. I don't know if I was in Rotterdam when you were there briefly with working with Gary Bates and other people, but it was a really, really exciting time to be in the Netherlands. A lot of money, a lot of exciting young architects were able to build things, not just draw them up on paper. And it was a really incredible time. At that time, the accent that charmed the world was a Dutch accent. And there's some real truth to the observation that someone made recently that that whole Dutch way of practicing and that whole let's say intellectual model moved north to Copenhagen. Probably sometime around 2000, 2001, 2002. And now the accent, of course, that we're all charmed and taken with is a Danish accent, not a Dutch accent. So, and I think that's true not only of the accent but of the ideas. Really, that powerful intellectual model, I think, moved north. Bjarke, of course, has been able to do things that Rim did not do. He's building in New York City, for example. I mean, I think Rim did a little small building in New York City, but 57th Street is bigger than anything OMA, I think, ever thought of. It's certainly bigger than that building at Cornell down the road. There's probably some Cornell people here. In any case, as you know, and he'll show and talk about a lot of these projects, he has, BIG has stakes put down on the East Coast with the 57th Street project, but more. Also, very exciting. If you have not seen it, the exhibit at the National Building Museum will be up, I think, until August. An incredible show. The catalog is here. We have it in our library, and we'll get a copy of that signed later by Bjarke. Definitely should see that, but also he's doing, or the office is doing a master plan for a 10-year plan for the Smithsonian. A lot of buildings on the West Coast, including, of course, as you probably know, the Google campus, which is the coolest job I think ever. But with BIG, that's probably only the case for this year. Next year, they'll get the next coolest job ever. So. I don't want to say very much more because I've already said too much, but I will ask you to joining me in welcoming to Syracuse, Bjarke Ingels.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe just picking up on, we were just talking, I've been trying to come and visit Michael wherever he's been dean. The last time was at his former deanship where he got a speeding ticket taking me to the lecture. So there's like some real investment in this. But what I'd like to do is basically spend a little bit of time talking about the way we work in our office. Our office is obviously called BIG. We're located in New York and in Copenhagen. Our space is actually a former Carlsberg factory where they used to make the least interesting part of the beer, the bottle cap. We've diversified into haircuts. But maybe as I think every 5 or 6 years we've been doing a sort of an exhibition looking back at the work we've done. It's almost like this sort of process of when you're caught up in your work, you're only thinking about the projects at hand. But once in a while, when you have to look back and try to see if there's a red line going through the work you've done so far, it becomes a way of almost like the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard says, life is lived forward, but it's understood backwards. And we just came out of making the exhibition at the National Building Museum. The National Building Museum is this amazing space in Washington that I think nobody has ever been to. This is like this huge atrium with a gigantic colonnade on multiple levels going around. And they had given us 3 small galleries for our exhibition. And they were like really nice gallery spaces, but of course we really liked the atrium. So we got this idea to turn the architecture of the museum into the architecture of the exhibition. Our galleries were placed on the 2nd floor. So we used the galleries for movies, like films by various filmmakers, showing the work after it's been complete. But then we basically turned this sort of arcade into the exhibition design. So rather than building vitrines, each arch becomes a window onto a model that is suspended in the atrium. There's like 72 arches, so 72 models. The handrail became the exhibition graphics, so the narrative that goes along with the models. And then we basically thought that, now it became this sort of almost like an odyssey through the body of work we've been doing the last 6 or 7 years. And we thought, what could be the organizing principle for this journey around the world in 800 feet? And we thought, one of my favorite architecture shows ever was Bernard Rudowski's show at the MoMA in the 60s called Architecture Without Architects, a short introduction to non-pedigreed architecture. And essentially, what it was all about was that he had sort of noticed how the international style of modernism had made buildings look identical everywhere. So this is the Lever House in New York City, this is the Royal Hotel in Copenhagen, 2 completely different cities, like identical buildings. Basically it's because the international style of modernism came with the advent of building services and building engineering. And essentially it was like this technological freedom, Suddenly there was like electric lights, so we weren't dependent on windows to be able to see inside. There was like mechanical ventilation, so we didn't have to open the windows to get fresh air. There was like central heating and air conditioning, so we were independent on the thickness of the walls. So in the end, like the architecture didn't do anything anymore. It just became like an empty container of space with a gas-guzzling basement full of machinery that would pump qualities, air, light, temperature into the building. And as a result, buildings started looking the same everywhere. And what he was interested in was that what he called vernacular architecture, which is essentially that over centuries, people in different places had found ways of responding to the local climate with the local materials in a way that would optimize living conditions and create this sort of really interesting architectural vocabularies that weren't academic or aesthetic, but purely empirical. So like the Greek villages with white surfaces that reflect heat, the flat roofs where you can go up and enjoy the cool breeze in the evening. Like the igloo is also like this perfect example where the spherical shape has the minimum surface to create to sort of contain a maximum interior volume to sort of create the minimal thermal exposure for the contained space. These like villages in China where the wind swept the flatlands. You have the sunken courtyards that are protected from the weather. So what we in a way propose is not vernacular, like to go back to vernacular architecture, but what you could call vernacular 2.0, and essentially use the fact that today we have sophisticated technology that allows us to calculate and simulate and model the environmental performance of a building, like the thermal exposure of a design, the sort of the wind flows through a building or a master plan. So rather than architecture without architects, which of course as an architect in an architecture school I'm critical of architecture without architects, but engineering without engines, this idea that you can actually use sophisticated contemporary technology to make designs where the performance of the building is independent of active machinery and is actually nested into the bones of the building. So rather than the typical world map, as you know it, of nation states, the climate map suddenly becomes interesting. And you also see that not only do you within like a climate region have certain criteria that are the same across nation states, but also on the other side of the equator or on other parts of the world, you might have similarities where similar conditions, similar climates could maybe sort of inspire related solutions. So essentially we decided to organize the exhibition as this odyssey from across the climates, from the coldest climate where we ever built and the hottest. It becomes this sort of journey through the different climate zones. The catalog that comes with the exhibition is color-coded, a bit like National Geographic, where you have the yellow frame. But here the frame is color-coded according to climate. So we start in the warmest climates where we've built, and then gradually as the color of the frame cools down, the climate does as well. And also one thing you really see is that when we are sort of in the extreme climates, the architecture is totally dictated by the climate to sort of survive the heat or resist the cold. And towards the middle, other factors, other conditions take over. And as a nice side effect, all this sort of rainbow of frames become this nice gay flag on the edge of the book. And also, like sometimes the most interesting thing about a book is the cover. Here the cover is as white as can be, and it's actually the content that is the flashiest part of the book. And then it has a dust jacket, which is this thermal map, where basically hot and cold creates this pattern of the flow from hot on the front to cold at the back. So maybe just to start this odyssey, one of the warmest climates we've worked, and one of the first times where we started to work with this idea of engineering without engines was we got invited to do a competition for the main energy company in Shenzhen in South China, right next to Hong Kong. It's the most industrious region in the world. Most of the stuff you own is probably produced in Shenzhen. So as a result, the energy company does consume and deliver a lot of energy. We thought it's basically a 1 million square foot office building in a subtropical climate. And you have this dilemma between you want to maximize daylight and views, but you want to minimize thermal exposure and glare. As a result, together with Arab, we developed this idea of a facade, almost like a pleated dress, that opens up to views in daylight to the north, but shuts off the direct sunlight from the south. So when you look towards the sun, you see these like bamboo veneer walls washed in daylight, and as you turn around, it becomes a sort of a completely transparent facade. Within this logic, we can sort of pull out bigger openings for the main entrances. We can create this sort of stack of executive meeting rooms and the sky lobby. So basically, this logic alone, without any moving parts, any sophisticated technology, actually reduces the air conditioning loads and the energy consumption with 30%. We developed the principle together with Arab. So there's like nothing sophisticated. It's purely the geometry of the building that has this impact. Also from inside, of course, it has an impact on the experience of the building. And essentially the main idea is that what makes the Shenzhen energy headquarters look different is also what makes the building perform different in terms of its energy pattern. It's currently under construction in China. After digging around underground for 3 years, we're finally going vertical at a pretty amazing speed. So basically, when we were like looking into to this project, we had won the competition on this design, and an interesting thing happened. Like the clients, they fell in love with the design of the building, like the way it looked, not so much the performance. So we started developing the logic further, and we actually proposed a series of modifications to the envelope that would make it perform even better. But at this point, they had sort of they'd fallen in love with this reading that the building looked like a Chinese girl walking through the city or something like that, and we couldn't touch the design because it had already been signed off by decision makers high up in the food chain. But then we got invited to do a competition for the Museum of the Human Body in Montpellier, in the south of France. Montpellier is almost like the cradle of modern medicine in Europe. The sort of the proximity to North Africa and the Middle East made it a perfect place for coming together of Western and Eastern medicine. It's the home of the first botanical garden for medicine in Europe, the Jardin des Plantes. And the museum was going to be located between the city and this new park. The mayor of Montpellier is a medical doctor, or was a medical doctor, so she sort of was behind this initiative. The program consists of a series of different exhibitions and event spaces organized along a central spine so they can function autonomously but also as a single entity. So we basically took this like functional diagram and placed it in the park, but rather than becoming like a big wall that segregates the city from the park, by having this sort of almost like a zipper of this sort of undulating line, we dissolve the building. Even though it functions as a single entity, it ends up appearing as a series of pavilions, and basically it creates these pockets of city that comes into the park, and these pockets of park that come into the city, almost like a sort of confluence of pavement and green space. So you see like this sort of the city coming in and becoming like a little paved island overlooking the park. And in reverse, the park sort of flowing in between the hard paved spaces of the city. So Montpellier is not only the cradle of modern medicine in Europe, it's also the hottest city in France. So we wanted to have glass facades to create a relationship between the program and the park, but we would have to somehow provide some form of shading. And following some of the logic we had developed in Shenzhen, we looked a little bit deeper into the issue, and basically one of the things we discovered in Shenzhen is that when you're facing south, the ideal louver is actually horizontal, because you have the sun coming from a high angle. So horizontal louvers, they block the high incoming sun and they provide open views. But when you are facing east or west, the more ideal louvers are vertical, as we did in Shenzhen. Also the main facades in Shenzhen are east and west facing, that's why the logic makes sense. But then when you apply this logic to a curvilinear facade, the ideal angle actually changes more gradually from horizontal through a whole series of different degrees of diagonal to vertical. So basically we created a script that is actually applicable to any location on the planet, but in this case we did it for Montpellier, where we can sort of calculate the incoming angle of the sun for different orientations of the facade. And that basically translates into this sort of curvilinear pattern that almost looks like a human thumbprint. It gets this sort of ornamental character, but it is purely a sort of like really a scientific approach where each orientation of the louver is optimized for the angle it's facing. So basically we applied this script to the facade, and as a result we get this almost like an environmental ornament of the facade depending on where it's oriented. So everywhere you sort of encounter the building, this sort of organic sort of aesthetic is purely a product of optimizing the sort of environmental performance of the envelope. So in a way you can actually turn the environmental performance of the building into something that really drives the aesthetic aspect of it. Sadly, shortly after we won the competition, there was elections, and the new mayor is a former postman, and now he wants to make a postal museum instead. So I think right now our biggest challenge is to convince the mayor that this could also be a very nice postal like the response to the climate doesn't have to be defensive. It can also be, embracive and joyful. One example is that we're doing a project in Nassau in the Bahamas, in a community called Albany. It's Tiger Woods and two real estate developers that have come together to make a very nice place for fortunate people. It's actually, if you watch the scene where Daniel Craig comes out of the water in Casino Royale, flashing a perfect torso, that's this place. And they made a marina where you can park your 300-foot yacht. When I was there on a site visit, Steven Spielberg was trying to park his 300-foot yacht, and there they asked us to do a project of basically these condos facing a square. Because it's such a nice climate, it's facing south, it's overlooking the marina. They wanted each home to have a pool on the balcony and a 15-foot deep balcony. They had already done it on these three buildings that were under construction, and they had done it in the form of making a bathtub, like a giant bathtub on top of the balcony. And we thought, if you're going to have a pool on your balcony, you really don't want to jump up into it, you want to step down into the view and overlook the marina. So we designed each balcony in such a way that it sort of sags on the middle to create a space for the pool. The body of water is always sitting on top of the partition wall of the two units below, so that the 12-foot tall concrete wall can actually function as a giant beam to carry the load of the water. And basically, from the outside, this way of incorporating the pool sort of creates a character for the homes. Also, the sloping ceiling of the balcony becomes almost like a porch, almost like as if you're living in your own little villa. And basically the handrail, like normally when you make renderings, you kind of cheat and you eliminate all of the practicalities and you just have a single sheet of glass. In this case, it is actually a 75-foot long single sheet of acrylic aquarium glass that is the handrail and the facade of the pool. So it's like this sort of incredibly slick, like non-detailed balcony. Also, of course, it really becomes the facade of the building, so if you're skinny dipping at night, you need to make sure you have a rigorous fitness regime. But essentially, almost like the entire facade of the building is just, you know, the blatant expression of the unique quality of each home that suddenly comes together in this sort of honeycomb-like pattern. You see, like in general, like you know, as the journey moves from the warmer climates, where the projects really become about the climate, either resisting it or enjoying it. When you go towards the more temperate climates, other factors take over, and one factor can be the heritage of a place. We recently completed a building for the Danish Maritime Museum that is located right next to Hamlet's castle Kronborg in Copenhagen. The castle used to be the home of the museum, but then it became UNESCO World Heritage, and they had to kick the museum out and restore the old ballrooms to back when the king was around. And then the suggestion was basically to put the museum down in this decommissioned dry dock where they used to build ships. It's right outside the castle moat. And there was some kind of a dilemma, because UNESCO said that we had to stay below ground. We couldn't stick as much as a foot out of the ground to not interrupt the view of the castle. But of course the museum wanted some kind of architectural masterpiece to attract visitors. So we got the idea of basically turning the dock inside out to use the museum program to preserve the dock as a courtyard sunken into the ground. All we had to do was design a series of bridges, one that stops the water from coming in, one that connects to the castle, and then because we weren't even allowed to stick an elevator out of the ground, the last bridge is actually a gently sloping ADA accessible ramp that takes you into the museum. Also to prevent cars from driving off the road and dumping into the dock, we put these granite benches that are designed like the elements you moor a ship to. And they're actually put down in a Morse code. So there's a little Easter egg for people who can read Morse code. So then we started the excavation. We could build the bridges in a shipyard in China. Manufactured like giant ships, basically. Then sail them into the port and lift them into place like giant elements. So you see this sort of gradually descending ramp, and also maybe notice that the ramp is sunk into the roof so that the handrail is part of the steel structure of the roof, and you'll notice that the upper part of the bridge is very deep. It's like 6 feet, whereas the floor slab below is incredibly thin. We'll return to this. So you see this like gradually descending ramp that takes you into the exhibition, and then here the floor continues sloping with a very gentle slope, 1 to 60. It's essentially the same slope that you have in a bathroom floor. So it feels flat, but it allows the water to drain, and it actually allows people to go 2 floors down as they move around the dock. Some spaces are very intimate in proportion, some are very generous. Also, by code in Denmark, you have to have windows for workspaces. You can't have skylights or no windows. It has to look into something. So originally in the brief, all of the administration was put in another building. And now when we turned the dock into a courtyard, we could actually put the offices of the museum staff inside the dock. These are earth anchors that tie the dock down, because as soon as you drain all the water out, it becomes a giant ship that wants to like pop up and float away. So these anchors actually go 120 feet into the ground, which means that the Maritime Museum in Copenhagen is actually paradoxically the tallest building we've built in Denmark. It's just from the horizon and down. And here you can see basically the skinny floor slab of the zigzag bridge below, and the big proportion above. And that's basically made possible because the handrail contributes to the load-bearing capacity of the beam above. And then at the halfway point, we inserted a traditional anchor chain, so the floor that you're walking on is actually hanging in the ceiling above you. So in this way, like, it's not a piece of theater, it's actually a hard-working part of the architecture, just like the dock wall where they used to build ships is a real part. It's not a piece of set design, it's actually the actual dock where they used to build the ships. This like grid-like installation of little dots is actually the tension rods that keep the building from floating away. Here you see the auditorium where the slope of the auditorium continues under the stage and becomes the auditorium for children. The restaurant where the dock wall sort of continues inside, almost as a Roman ruin, left completely the way it was left by the shipbuilders. So in general, you have like this striking contrast between this incredibly contemporary world from the horizon and down, and then above the sort of the unmolested view of the historical castle. This is this sort of inverse Titanic moment. So basically, the whole idea is, like for each project, in a way, the design process is always about trying to sort of identify what is the specific piece of information we need in order to be able to inform our design decisions. So we always spend the beginning of a project to try to identify, in a way, educate ourselves in the specific problems or the specific aspects of this particular project, and then we try to identify what is the greatest problem or what is the biggest potential we can realize with this project, to establish the design criteria and then sort of identify all the knowledge, all the information we need to make informed design decisions. So that can be like the preservation of the historical heritage in the case of the Maritime Museum. Or for instance, we got invited by my old high school to make a big multi-hall for the school. It could be placed two places, either on the sports fields where they play soccer, or in the courtyard. And since football or soccer is the national sport of Denmark, or like most European countries, it would be very unpopular to shut down the outdoor football fields. So we said, let's put it in the courtyard, but then we would have to somehow, that's the only outdoor sort of social space between classes, so we would have to somehow dig it under the courtyard. Excavating can be costly, so we try to minimize the excavation, and the hall is proportioned to be able to accommodate a handball field, which is like the other national sport of Denmark. It was invented by a Danish officer, and the rules say that on the perimeter of the court you need 15 feet of clearance, and in the middle you need 30 feet. So since we got the job from my old math teacher, as a sort of homage to her, we based the design of the roof on the mathematical formula for a ballistic arch. So essentially the elegant curvature of the glulam beams are actually shaped by the mathematics of throwing a handball. So also the canteen has always been in the sort of high basement. So we created a new entrance from the street into the canteen, and from here you can continue into the sports hall. And in a way, like what you see is what you get. The concrete walls are the retaining walls. The glulam in the roof, the wood in the roof is the structure that carries the ceiling. You have daylight washing along the walls. And upstairs, we wanted to we knew that we were kind of invading the courtyard, so we wanted to, make it as accommodating as possible. So you have the height of a bench along the perimeter, and then we made this sort of fixed furniture that just indicates use, because basically the entire slope of the roof of the sports hall doesn't follow any of the rules or regulations that a normal public space or building requires. But still, the kids love to hang out on it. Actually, the janitor believes that he has a relatively scientific way of proving that we tripled the use of the courtyard after we did the building. is he had to put up 3 times as many trash bins. And then all the lighting is integrated into the furniture, so it becomes like this poetic little molehill in the courtyard. So basically, once you've identified what a project is all about, what's the dilemma, what's the challenge, what's the potential, you don't necessarily have the answer. You have the question, but you don't have the answer yet. So as part of our design process, we built tons of models to try to test different ideas. So basically, to give you an idea about what a process like that can look like, we're doing a project in this sort of beautiful landscape. It's the Venice in Switzerland, next between the Jura Mountains and the Alps. It's Le Brassus. It's a village that is famous for being almost like the cradle of Swiss watchmaking, and it's the home of Audemars Piguet, the Swiss watchmaker. That is one of the few Swiss watchmakers that is still on family hands. It's owned by the descendants of Monsieur Audemars and Piguet. And we were invited for a competition to design a museum of watchmaking. It's basically next to the building where Monsieur Audemars and Piguet had their first workshop at the top 150 years ago, and this is their current headquarters. So our first thinking was to try to wedge the museum in the gap between the two historical buildings in different ways. We tried various ways of sort of fitting in an elegant way, but in the end, it always felt like we were sort of butting in between two existing buildings with some like unwelcome new addition. We thought maybe we should stay low at the back, away from the main street, overlooking the landscape. We thought maybe like the museum program with the different exhibition spaces could be almost like a little village of interconnected galleries. We try to organize it as a sort of it's a linear program, so like as a route where you end up visiting the ancient workshop where it all started. But somehow it became hard to control the process. Maybe we should just stay as part of the landscape, and then gradually, like the investigations took on a life of their own. So basically, the thinking we ended up with was basically to take the program that has this sort of series of spaces, from small to big and to small again, turn it into a single linear narrative, and then to coil it up like a sort of double spiral that fits on the side and creates a big space in the middle. So basically, it becomes like this sort of arrival where you go through the journey, have the bigger spaces in the middle, and then finally you reach the historical workshop, and then you're done. Then we allow the roof to sort of follow the slope of the landscape to bring light and view deep into the floor plates. So it becomes almost like this sort of ressort spiral, the coil inside a watch that actually delivers the energy for the timekeeping piece. So when you arrive through the existing headquarters, the first thing you see is you get this view over the valley, and then you have a series of spaces, some of them with like very controlled lighting conditions, some where you actually pass through some of the specialty workshops with beautiful views of the surrounding valley. And then you find yourself in the middle, and you'll notice one thing. Because of the slender roof and the abundance of glass, you actually have the presence of the mountains everywhere in the exhibition. And you notice that there are absolutely no columns. That's basically can I borrow this? It's because one of the main aspects of watchmaking is this idea of trying to sort of squeeze the maximum amount of performance out of the minimal amount of material. Miniaturization and skeletonization is part of the aspects of watchmaking. And glass is actually stronger than steel when it comes to compression, but it can't take tension, and then it has a tendency to buckle in earthquakes, and when it buckles, it breaks. And you have earthquakes in the Jura Mountains, but because of the continuous curvature of the glass, the curvature actually lends rigidity to the thin piece of material. So because of the curvature of the walls, we can actually use the glass as the sole support for the ceiling. So you have this like very magical floating ceiling, and it's like incredible transparency, bringing the valley into the exhibition. And then finally, you have this stair that takes you to the workshop in the attic. So basically, when you tell the story like this, you know, it seems almost like a sort of a very linear process of like cause and effect that brings you to like, this almost feels like the obvious answer for this program on this site. But actually, in order to get there, we had to kiss quite a few frogs before we found sort of the main idea. So like basically, once you, first you identify the criteria that are going to shape the project, and then you sort of start testing it with almost like a process of trial and error. And as part of this making of models, we do make a lot of models in our office. And sometimes we make giant models, and sometimes we make models out of Lego. As a result, we actually have these are just like some random photos from the office. You have a residue of Lego. Even the signage on our shelves is made out of Lego. When we got approached by Lego to make a museum called the Lego House that essentially looks at the culture of the world through the eyes of Lego, we were sort of incredibly excited. We went completely bananas. This is a typical sort of residue of the design process, like different models, testing ideas, a lot of sort of information and studies on the walls. And it resulted in a project that is currently under construction for the Lego House in Billund, which is where Lego is from. It creates a big public square inside, and then underneath this cloud of interconnected exhibition spaces, the roofscape actually becomes a series of connected playgrounds where not just visitors to the Lego Museum, but all of the citizens of the village that Lego is located in Denmark actually have access to this sort of man-made playscape on top of the building. This laid the foundation stones last year. This is one of my favorite photos. It's me and all of the richest people in Denmark. I like this idea that the richest guy in Denmark is the guy who owns Lego. It's almost like a Willy Wonka kind of situation. And also the project is actually already available as a piece of Lego architecture. I think it's one of the few pieces of Lego architecture where we didn't have to modify the design to make it buildable out of Lego. So basically moving, we're still in the temperate climates, other aspects that can influence design can be the synergy between the different parts of the program. One of the projects we did in Copenhagen is a mixed-use building with shops and offices on the ground close to the customers, and basically townhouses and apartments that are placed on top. We exploit the difference in depth between commercial floor plates and residential floor plates to create this sort of man-made mountain path that actually takes you all the way to the penthouse in a sort of seamless extension of the street. It's located at the city limits of Copenhagen. We basically have other life forms outside this lake. And what it does, it doesn't only allow us to optimize the conditions for each program, bringing the residences up in the light or creating gardens in front of the townhouses, but it also allows us to expand the possibility for social encounters. So you literally have this mountain path where kids living on the 6th floor can run down and play with their neighbors. So you have social life and public life happening on multiple levels throughout the city. And part of the exhibition in Washington is that Louise Lemoine and Ila Baker made a film called The Infinite Happiness. The building is called the 8 House or the Infinity Loop. And they basically moved to one of the apartments in the 8 House for 21 days and did 21 diaries, which is a really beautiful 19-minute film. where you can see sort of the impact of the social possibilities of the architecture on the life in the building. Where the 8 house sort of intersects itself, we sort of took all of the amenities and connected them with this bouncing stair that connects all the way from the street to a shared roof terrace. And essentially the 8 house isn't just like a nice facade or like an expressive sculpture. It's really like a three-dimensional urban condition where, these two people, they actually get to know their neighbors. These two girls, they are neighbors living on the 8th and the 10th floor, and they can like literally walk down and invite each other to play. So you have a much more sort of lively social organism than a typical vertical stacking of homes. So in this sense, it's basically the programmatic synergy, the optimization of the different constituent parts of the program that creates the architecture. So as you can see, like often, like the public aspect of a project is quite important to us, but the concerns for the users. But in one case, we actually sort of reached out to the users and had them basically co-author the design in a sort of open source design process. We got invited to do an urban space in Copenhagen. It's a mile long, and it basically consists of what we call the red square, where everything is shades of red, the black market, where everything is black and white, and the green park. And it's located in the most ethnically diverse neighborhood in all of Denmark. You have more than 60 different nationalities. So this project was going to be all about creating ownership and integration. So we thought, like, why don't we use it as a resource? We reached out to the local community and had people recommend elements from their other home country. We had public meetings, we had a website, we had a Facebook page, we had ads in the newspapers. And people ended up recommending elements. And the basic idea is that, we don't eat Chinese food to be nice to the Chinese. We do it because we crave, Beijing duck or noodles. And the same idea is that we didn't put a Moroccan fountain in Copenhagen to be nice to the Moroccans, but because they have an amazing tradition for architectural water features. There's a Jamaican sound system where wirelessly you can connect your iPhone and have an outdoor concert. The neighbors obviously hate this element, but it's actually designed so it can't play louder than the allowable volume, and it shuts off at 9 p.m. There's a Thai boxing arena from Thailand, swimmers from Iraq, trash cans from Great Britain. You have bollards from Ghana, bicycle racks from Finland. The sign on the red square is an actual sign from the red square in Moscow. Awesome bus stops from Kazakhstan. We found palm trees in China that actually grow in a Danish climate naturally. There's like nice octopus from Japan. That sort of shows that play is this ultimate element across language and culture. When you look at the benches, it becomes like a cultural study. You have a Mexican S-curve love seat where you're looking the person you're sitting next to into the eyes. You have a Belgian bench where everybody looks away from each other. So it becomes almost like this sort of architectural safari in urban space, like down to the lamps. We have a series of neon signs that advertise things you can't buy in Denmark. So this is a Qatari dentist, and like on the red square, like these sort of former socialist or Soviet neon propaganda. And together with Superflex and Topoteca 1, we made an app where you can actually see the story of each object. Where does it come from? Who recommended it? Why is it here? So it's essentially like almost like an urban space in Copenhagen that truly reveals the diversity of contemporary Copenhagen rather than perpetuating this idea of a monocultural city. So I often get the objection that this only works in sort of a semi-socialist Scandinavia. But we got invited like 6 years ago or 5 years ago to look at a site on the west side of Manhattan. That's why I moved to America in 2010. And it's a site that is on the waterfront, but it is sandwiched between a power plant, a sanitation garage, and the West Side Highway. It's quite far from Central Park. So we thought, like, what they really need is an oasis, and essentially the Copenhagen courtyard, you can say, is at the architectural scale what Central Park is at the urban scale, an oasis in the middle of the city. This is the city block in Copenhagen where my dad grew up, where my grandparents lived. So we thought, like, what happens when you combine the density of the American skyscraper with the communal space of the Copenhagen courtyard? Or essentially, what could a court scraper look like? So we placed the courtyard next to the existing building. We provided with the density of a high-rise by lifting it up to 500 feet in the northeast corner, keeping the southwest low to make it open for sunshine and views over the water. The result is this like rather striking new silhouette on the waterfront of Manhattan. You have like terraces that are sunken into the roof, so that each home actually has like nice balconies. From the east, it looks like a spire. And when you enter into the lobby, you are sort of invited up into this courtyard that actually has exactly the same proportions as Central Park, only it's like 13,000 times smaller. Sort of bonsai Central Park. And you have this like incredible contrast between the height of a handrail in the southwest to the height of a high-rise in the northeast. The terraces in the roof. That sort of, I think this is really like one of the striking things of the project is when you're living here, like you have the privacy and the intimacy of your own private space in the middle of the city. But then when you go to the edge, you actually find yourself part of almost like this like alpine community. You can actually see all your neighbors around you. It went through a rezoning process, and it's currently under construction. This is what it looked like a few months ago. There's like this nice topping ceremony, so there's like a stars and stripes from the pinnacle or the apex of the pyramid. And it will be like a rather striking addition to the west side waterfront of Manhattan. So essentially almost like, it's like the unlikely hybrid of two seemingly mutually exclusive typologies, the Scandinavian courtyard building and the American skyscraper combined into a new entity. Having just arrived in New York, Sandy came and shut down my apartment and my office for 2 weeks. It took the whole city by surprise. Also, according to the New Yorker, it gave rise to a new neighborhood in New York, Soho, south of Power. And basically, what has happened is that with the rising temperatures, the Atlantic hurricane belt has sort of expanded north and south, which means that suddenly the northeast coast of America is being hit more and more frequently by stronger and stronger hurricanes. And because of the funnel shape of the New York Bight, New York City is actually extra prone or has an extra risk. 50% of the city is at risk. And when you look at lower Manhattan, the zone that got wiped out by Sandy, you can see that since the 17th century we have been expanding Manhattan through landfill. And essentially all of the area that we have created ourselves, where we are responsible for having created this land, is also where we need to take extra responsibility for protecting it. So basically the big challenge is how can you create 10 miles of waterfront protection without creating this seawall that segregates the life of the city from the water around it. And we looked at the High Line. The High Line is interesting because the High Line is actually a decommissioned piece of infrastructure that has been added, a program for the life of the city. So we thought, like, what if you don't have to wait until the infrastructure shuts down and you convert it into a promenade? what if you can actually make the resilience infrastructure of Manhattan in a way that it actually comes with programs for the people in the different communities. And you can say Manhattan, or like New York city development, has happened very much shaped by the encounter between these two people. On one hand, you have Robert Moses, the power broker, who was responsible for a lot of the public works in New York City, a lot of the highways, a lot of the sort of public housing. Very, very efficient, but a very, very top-down approach, where often the projects would have like negative side effects, like highways that would shut the city off from reaching the water or disconnect one neighborhood from another. And on the other hand, at some point, he was trying to run a highway through Greenwich Village, and he encountered Jane Jacobs, who, rooted in the local community, managed to sort of mount enough resistance to cancel the plans. And we thought, in a way, in this case, we need both approaches. We thought, like, what if we could conceive of the dry line, as we've called this project, as the love child of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. Because on one hand, you need, 10 miles of contiguous waterfront protection, but to make it urbanistically successful, it has to happen rooted in a close dialogue with the local community. So we actually took the SEER report and all the recommendations for flood protection, worked with like some of the best Dutch flood protection engineers in the world, and then we reached out to all of the different local communities and started this process where we co-designed through a series of meetings with them what would be their dreams and their concerns for how to design their waterfront to be more safe but also more inviting for the life in the city. And we made this like short film with the people we worked with, showing the vision for the dry line.
That was actually why Sandy was so bad, is because of the phase of the moon, it was already a very large high tide, as well as the storm surge coming in with the wind and the tide lining up perfectly to give us 14-foot tides instead of 8-foot.
The most shocking part of Hurricane Sandy was the fact that it exceeded expectations.
I think the sheer magnitude of it caught a lot of people off guard.
When Hurricane Sandy came, we were not prepared at all. I mean, not even the slightest.
Yeah, it was like an alien invasion of water. And not the good kind of water.
So yeah, I mean, it came right in front where there was literally boats on 14th Street floating in front of our window.
We had a sub-basement level office a block from here. And it was totally covered in water for 2 days. So we lost everything. Everything.
We're really concerned about another storm and the flooding that's possible, and we think that the next time it's going to come even further inland.
I'd like to see some type of flood protection in this area. That's going to happen. We're vulnerable, obviously, being close to the water.
Something that just brings like more walks, different walks of life. Another escape from just the busyness and the hustle and bustle.
There's this great space that could really become community space, cultural space, and active uses.
Everyone enjoys space. And in New York and other congested cities, it's hard to come by.
Anything that makes the cities greener is just such a wonderful thing for not only the environment, but the people that live in the city too, to be able to be around that space.
The plans, the berming, the sense of how it can become into the natural landscape itself, how we want to program that is really the next challenge. we are the link, we're the tip in the sense of the big U. It's important that the entire waterfront of Lower Manhattan build in the plans that have been put forward, because we can not only fortify this great city of New York, but be a model for cities all over the world.
So basically the dry line has now been funded with $335 million from the federal funds, and we are, together with the City of New York, we're starting the East River part of it. So basically sort of an extreme open source design effort. Basically also like having moved to America, we also started then encountering you know, a whole new sort of form of density and building typology. We're doing a project in Vancouver, which is still like Vancouver is a rather sort of temperate climate. So again, it's not the climate that's dictating the architecture. In this case, it's the context. It's located right where Granville Bridge hits downtown, and sort of slices this piece of land into these useless triangles. There's like a series of setback requirements from the streets, setback requirements from the bridge. There's another sort of setback of 100 feet because the city wants to make sure that nobody lives and looks straight into the traffic of the bridge. Then there's a park where we're not allowed to cast any shadows. So we're left with like a tiny triangular floor plate, 6,000 square feet, which is like almost too small to build. So we thought like, if the 100-foot setback has to do with creating a minimum distance, once we get 100 feet up in the air, we can actually come back out and sort of create a floor plate twice as big, 12,000 square feet. That means that when you drive over the bridge, it's almost as if someone is pulling a curtain aside, sort of welcome to Vancouver. It has this feeling of a genie coming out of a bottle, sort of growing to twice the size. Because it's a gradual transition, something you call walking the column. There's no shocking cantilever. It's just basically the columns at the top gradually turn into to wall slabs that then sort of makes the transition. It's never more than a foot per floor. So this is the top floor and this is the bottom. Also, like you can see that even though it looks both curving and triangular in when you look at the building, everything is 90 degrees only. It's super rational and super sort of modular. But when it comes together, it actually creates this rather unusual silhouette. In a way, it reminded us of the Flatiron. The Flatiron is a product of this moment in Manhattan real estate history where you know, the rise in real estate prices, the advent of steel structure and elevators suddenly made this plot that had been useless because it happens at the intersection between Broadway and the grid of Manhattan, and suddenly became the namesake of a whole neighborhood in the city. Except we're taking that idea like one step further. And basically underneath the bridge, we can do shops, offices, restaurants, and we're trying to turn the underside of the bridge into an attraction. So we're working with a series of local Vancouver artists, including Rodney Graham, to turn the underside of the bridge into what you could call the 16th chapel of street art, like almost like an art gallery turned upside down with these like photo prints that sort of illuminate the space underneath the bridge. We just broke ground on this project 3 weeks ago in Vancouver. The same client approached us to do a project in Calgary, also in Canada, which was going to be essentially headquarters for TELUS, the cell phone company, and residential. And it suspiciously looks like we took the Vancouver Tower and turned it upside down. But basically what it is that it's the lowest part of the building is an office building where you want to maximize the floor plates to be as efficient as possible. And then on top you need more slender floor plates for residences that also want balconies. But TELUS, the company, wanted the whole tower to look as a single identity, to be the TELUS Tower, instead of having an office building with a residence on top. So by making this sort of seamless transition from office to residential, the smooth facade of the offices become the facade with balconies for the residences. As a result, it also becomes sort of the most slender tower on the skyline. So in a way, you can say like two rather different conditions have almost the same but opposite architecture as a result. Finally, if we sort of skate through some of the colder climates, we're doing, again, looking at how the context of a project can inform its architecture. We got invited to do a museum in a sculpture park in Norway, a beautiful park on either side of a river. We thought, instead of, we could locate the museum ourselves, and we thought, what if the museum really becomes part of walking through the sculpture park? There's an existing bridge, and what if the museum becomes the other bridge, so it turns the whole sculpture park into a single loop? We have a 3-story stack of galleries where the path enters into the galleries. The skylight, where you have the sculptures, turn 90 degrees and becomes a panoramic window of overlooking the river. And then you continue your journey through the park. So the building basically becomes this sort of hybrid between a museum, a bridge, and an art piece in its own right. When you go through the sculpture park, you might actually see the museum as one of the biggest sculptures in the park itself, rather than a building that is different from the park. And finally, in one of the colder climates we've ever worked, we're doing a project for the National Art Museum of Greenland. Greenland recently acquired independence from Denmark. The museum is located on the waterfront of Nuuk, the capital. And you see these buildings have been built by the Danish authorities as housing for rehousing the fishermen into nice apartment blocks that completely ignore the fact that they're built in Greenland. So like they look as if they're in flat Denmark. So we thought what we designed the new museum is the smallest possible gallery that can create a sculpture courtyard. But rather than ignoring the landscape, the perfect circle and plan is melted, if you like, so it follows the topography of the site. Almost like a beached whale. Following the topography, it lifts up, inviting people to enter into the exhibition. Here you have sort of a descending picture gallery that takes you to a loop of gallery spaces that have artificial light in half of them and light from the courtyard the other half. But the main sort of political statement is that as soon as you enter into the circle, the melted nature creates this sort of tilted horizon that creates a framed view of the Greenlandic nature, the mountains, the icebergs, the snow in the winter, the plants in the summer, the sculptures in the sculpture courtyard, all the Greenlandic artworks. But all of the Danish architecture, all of the Danish heritage has been eliminated from the view, so it becomes almost this oasis of Greenlandicness in the city dominated by the Danish authorities. And finally, the coldest climate we've ever worked. We're doing a ski hotel in the north of Lapland in Finland. It's placed on top of the ski terrain, and we've designed the buildings so that they frame a courtyard, and all of the suites that face the sloping roof and the main elevator core actually takes you to the roof, so that in the morning you take the elevator up and then you ski out on the roof. You're already part of the ski terrain. And actually we made the whole master plan so that no surface has a slope that is more horizontal than 7% of inclination. So this is the first manifestation of literal ski in, ski out. You will never have to take your skis off. And of course, as a result, the spaces inside get this sort of a character of the sloping roof. And when you look out at the neighbor buildings, they're almost an extension of the landscape. So, so basically, having sort of completed this journey, of course, there's a lot of different strategies. Like, it's not only the response to the climate, but there's like so many different factors that can actually influence the architecture. We're making one project right now that somehow seems to sum up all of the things we've been working on for the last 15 years. It's a project we're doing on the waterfront of Copenhagen, and it could be the landmark of Copenhagen in a few years. But it's not a royal palace, and it's not a cultural palace. It's essentially a power plant that turns household waste into electricity and district heating. Basically, all of the citizens of Copenhagen, they throw out their trash, and then it comes back in the form of heat and electricity. If you look at trash as a resource, 1 ton of trash contains 1 2/3 of an oil barrel of energy. But these facilities operate on an economy of scale, so they are basically big, ugly boxes that cast shadows on the neighbors and block the views. This is going to be the tallest and biggest building in all of Copenhagen. And it's right next to the Copenhagen Marina, and where the locals go water skiing. So we thought, like, how can we design this in such a way that it becomes a contribution to the neighborhood? And speaking of skiing, Danes love to ski. We have snow, but we have absolutely no mountains. We have to go to Sweden or Norway or the Alps. But apparently we have mountains of trash. So we know exactly how big this facility is going to be. It's going to be more than 300 feet tall. This is the closest ski mountain we have to Copenhagen. It's 6 hours away in Sweden. We can do 2/3 of that on the roof of our building. So basically, we just follow the different machinery. We design the roof of the building as a continuous slope with a blue, a black, and a green ski slope. It has a lift system and also a vertical elevator. We place real pine trees on top of the columns, so you actually get sort of an actual man-made mountain. We did this in a competition where they asked for a power plant, and miraculously we won the competition with this idea. Suddenly we had to figure out how to do it in real life. Just like, even you can see this is the roof plan, and you can see like these are like emergency vents. So you have like almost like this sort of almost like volcanic activity inside the hill that has to come out in different ways. Also, to give you a sense of scale, this is an Olympic half pipe. So it's actually it's twice as long as an Olympic half pipe. It's a pretty serious mountain. You also have a hiking path. Like in Sochi, Denmark won 0 medals. We hope, because now we can practice at home, maybe we can improve on that statistic in the years to come. For people who don't want to ski, you actually have a hiking path where you can go up and enjoy the view of the otherwise completely horizontal city of Copenhagen. We're going to have the tallest climbing wall in the world. 300 feet of like ultimate danger. And basically the reason that this was even possible is because this, you can say like, this is like coming quite close to realizing this sort of diagram I showed in the beginning, this idea of thinking about cities and buildings as man-made ecosystems, is that not only do we harvest the local resources, the rainwater for the green facade, natural daylight, natural ventilation, but also together with the city of Copenhagen, the power plant forms like almost like an urban metabolism, converting waste into a resource. But the reason that we could actually win the competition with this idea was because one thing that is unique about this power plant is that it's the cleanest waste-to-energy power plant in the world. The smoke that comes out of the chimney is completely non-toxic. It contains some steam and some CO2. So in a way, by turning the roof into a ski slope and a public park, we make it, very apparent, something that would otherwise be invisible, which is that you actually have if you like, fresh mountain air on the roof of the power plant, to sort of completely sort of create this like transformed perception of what a power plant can be. We decided to play with the chimney, and we worked with Realities United and Copenhagen Suborbitals and the Danish Technical University to design the chimney in such a way that it sort of accumulates steam, and then at regular intervals it puffs a gigantic smoke ring. And it's basically, back to this idea of information-driven design. One of the main drivers of behavioral change is knowledge. That if people don't know, they can't act, and nobody knows how frequent we emit CO2. But if you come to Copenhagen, each steam ring is going to represent 1 ton of CO2. So, of course, once we won the competition, we also had to realize the steam rings. And the Yellow Pages doesn't have any contractors for giant steam rings. So after a lot of testing with Copenhagen University and this group called Copenhagen Suborbitals, which is essentially a bunch of do-it-yourself people that make space rockets in something that looks like a bicycle shop. We've made these tests, and last summer we finally had some interesting results. So I really like this this image of the exhaust from a power plant turning into sort of a halo floating in the sky. So now I have to compete with my emotional soundtrack here. Because essentially, I think one of the things about architecture that I think is truly fascinating is that architecture is the art and science of turning fiction into fact. Because when you're sitting in the office and you're like brainstorming with the team, you're coming up with wild ideas. You're conjuring something that is pure fiction. It's just like a child of your imagination. And then you spend the next 6 years or a decade solving all the problems, like, working with a program, getting all the yeses from the different consultants and clients, getting the permits, getting the funding secured, doing all the construction. And finally, when you're done, something that was pure fiction has now become hard fact. And in a way, it has this like almost like world-changing capacity that, like in 2 years when we're done with this power plant, not only can we maybe start getting some medals in the Olympics, but also it will completely have changed people's perception of what kind of a city is Copenhagen and what can a city be. And I really like this idea that in a few years you might hear this conversation where somebody says like, yeah, I went to Europe, it's amazing. In Venice, in Italy, they sail in gondolas through the streets that are paved with water. And in Denmark, they ski on their power plants that turn trash into electricity and heating, and where the chimneys puff smoke rings. And that's just how it is. So I think like we should all really remember that apart from all of the specific tasks we have to solve as architects, and whenever we are called to intervene in a situation, to design an urban space or to solve a problem, we also have the opportunity and even the responsibility to make the world a little bit more like our dreams. Maybe as a little PS. I haven't talked about this before because we're still like not totally at liberty to speak about it, but it is actually out there. We've spent the last year working together with Thomas Heatherwick. We're in the middle of some kind of like musical act here, I don't know. Trying to sort of dream up what could be the future workplace of Google. And I'll just like talk about it briefly because like normally I've been trying to ignore it in the presentations because we can't talk too much about it. But then afterwards, all the questions are about Google, which is annoying. But basically, we were asked to like look at reinventing what could be the workplace of Google, and Google somehow became like famous for like these like colorful and playful interiors with sort of active environments with bicycles and like healthy food snacks. And suddenly, Google became the sort of the standard for Silicon Valley and even sort of contemporary creative new economy workplaces. And meanwhile, Google has gone from being the startup company to being 30,000 people worldwide. They also went from being purely immaterial, and they've gone into like creating cars, creating hardware. If anyone has tried Google Cardboard, it's pretty amazing. This like completely low budget, immersive experience. And also, if you look at Google in the context of Mountain View, the Google campus is pretty much the same size as the main urban streets of Mountain View, which is true for like almost all of Silicon Valley, is that for each town you have an equivalent corporate town of similar scale. So we spent the last year working with Hedwig Studio and Google to create what could be the future workspace. And I'll just like describe the principles, but essentially this idea of bringing, like right now, Silicon Valley really looks like a giant parking lot with some office parks, to bring the nature back into the space both outside and inside, to create this like very configurable human scale that is like incredibly interactive, and finally to create these like super light, transparent sort of canopies over the workspaces that actually gives you the feeling of working outdoor, even if you have controlled daylight and air quality. So the canopy is designed as this like almost like a glass fabric stretched out over a series of columns, creating these like very light enclosures. At the edges, we lift up this like transparent skirt to allow the content inside to spill to the outside, but also to invite people inside. So on the ground, we try to sort of concentrate the public-oriented activities. It can both be like auditoria and communal spaces for the Googlers, but it can also be retail for the public. Inside, the furniture underneath this glass fabric that takes care of, the weather, air quality, light. The configuration of the workspaces almost becomes like interconnecting platforms. In some cases, it's almost like a man-made mountain of different platforms. In one place, even though it's a multi-story building, each workspace connects to the next, to the next, to the next, so you can actually, without ever taking a stair or an elevator, you can walk to every single workspace in the area. Other places, we make it more like a city with streets and bridges that connect the different workspaces across the streets. Other places, it's more like almost like a European village with a sort of quirky, undulating spaces between the buildings. Sometimes we allow the public to actually pass directly through the buildings. Other times we lift up the skirt and invite the public to actually pass inside the building underneath the canopy. Some places the entire building lifts up and creates sort of a marketplace that is fully outdoor but undercover. Sometimes we lift the edges to create street fronts so that people living in the neighborhood won't just see sort of an office, but actually will see different restaurants and shops that actually create a more lively street experience. In some places, two adjacent buildings are actually connected. The landscape rises and leaves space for like an arena that connects the two buildings. So you have like this sort of on one hand like the glass canopy that creates this protected environment, and then the edge that makes sure that you always, even though these are like rather large structures, you always have a sort of very inviting and sort of human scale when you sort of connect or like reach the building. And basically, we've been working on this for the last year, and then you can see like how the sea of parking has been sort of completely replaced by bringing the nature and the water back into the valley. So we just submitted the designs for the city of Mountain View for approval, and in a month's time we'll know how to proceed. But essentially, it's been a sort of total fairy tale. I really look forward to being able to talk more in detail about what we're doing, because I think in this case, I've been used to being. My role has often been in our collaboration with our clients to take all of the requirements from the client and then, find ways of taking all of those aspects, knitting them together in such a way that we give the client everything he or she asked for, but in a way that they couldn't have imagined, and in a way breaking them a little bit beyond their traditional comfort zone. In a way, like inviting them on a journey that where we end up going maybe a little bit further than what they had imagined. And in this case, both me and Thomas Hedderwick have experienced almost the opposite, that we were like the technocratic, bureaucratic, practical people who we said, like, are you really sure that this is, okay, we'll figure it out. And I think one of the things that has been amazing to experience is this is really a client that sees the value of design and research. Because, of course, what they're used to is a business model where you throw a lot of resources into something that in a way you end up inventing something that can then be, mass-produced or like copied infinitely digitally, and then eventually you'll find a way of making money on it. So in this case, I've never experienced such an appetite for what you could call NRE, non-recoverable engineering. Essentially that we're being offered opportunities to invest into research, into glass technology, into structural technology, into all kinds of aspects of the design, where they're not going to spend millions on gold leaf or marble, but they're really prepared to spend millions on developing materials or technologies that are not yet in existence. If once we have developed them, we can then do it at reasonable cost. So in a way, they're prepared to consume or absorb incredible costs into development if only it creates something that can actually be applied rationally and effectively afterwards. So it's been a total adventure. Like, I think one of the first conversations where I really realized that we were dealing with a completely unique opportunity was that Larry Page was talking about a technology that I hadn't really heard about before, and then I asked, is this something that is already available on the market? And I said, yeah, we looked a little bit into it. There's a few things, but there's nothing really working right now, but I don't think it's anything that $50 million can't solve. And so that's definitely a completely new attitude, and in that sense, I'm quite excited by what can happen to the field of architecture now that a company like Google is putting all of their resources and all of their know-how and all of their capacity for innovation into the architectural realm.
Okay, working? No? Thank you, Bjarke. Just two quick comments. One, we'll have a reception after this, so if you don't get your question asked or answered, you can try it later. The other is this lecture is sponsored by Steve and Sherry Einhorn, and we're very happy that they have given us money to make this possible. So I think Bjarke will take a couple of questions. 3,
yes.
4, 5, however many. And I'll pass this around so that we can hear. There are people downstairs who may want to hear the questions as well as the answers. So We'll start with whoever raises their hand first. There's one.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bjarke, for coming here to Syracuse. My question is a two-parter. The very first question is very brief, and that is, as you listen to my second question, will you sign this book for me, please? I'll just pass that up.
Waste no. That's good. That's good. I'm all ears.
All right. And the second question is: recently, I had a discussion with another Danish architect who gave the criticism that here in the United States, our architecture is actually driven by developers. And one of the reasons why the United States is not one of the leaders in sustainable architecture is because of this fact, and the fact that in your home country and in countries such as Sweden and Finland, that the architecture is actually architecture driven. And I was just curious of what your thoughts are of the statement, and if you would agree with this conclusion.
I mean, I don't know that the architecture is ever architecture driven anywhere, but I think we're always asked to, solve a problem or accommodate an activity or, meet some kind of a demand or requirement or concern. So I think you always expect, like when I go to Japan, I'm thinking, okay, in Japan, like when you see the stuff that Sana, Sejima, Nishizawa, and Fujimoto are doing, you're thinking either they're like hypnotists or they, or like Japanese people are crazy, like, because when you, but of course they I guess meet the same kind of practicalities. Like we saw like one of Fujimoto's buildings where everything is 5 centimeters, like 2 inches thick. And we sort of, how do you deal with insulation? Because like it freezes in Tokyo, like it snows. We sort of insulating paint. So, but I think the fact is that I think as an architect, you somehow have to find ways of turning the success criteria, the dreams and the desires and the fears and the concerns of your client into the driving force of the design. So in that sense, I think I never argue anything with architecture because like nobody would take it serious. But once you can argue, like in the case of Vancouver, that we can increase your density with 50%, and it's the 50 nicest percent because it's the upper condos. Like if you take a typical condo in like an 850 square foot unit in Vancouver and you move it one floor up, it's $15,000 worth more. So anyway, if you can find a way of taking the success criteria of your client and turn that into the driving force of some kind of an architectural exploration, suddenly it can feel architecturally driven, and it will maybe in a way be architecturally driven because it's the way you put the design criteria together that actually drives the process.
Okay, more questions? No?
We are done. Was there a question? Huh?
One more? Wow. Okay. Before we go, I'm going to ask Bjarke to sign a book for the library, but I'm going to, because we're very cold here, I'm going to give him a scarf. Yeah,
Awesome.
you have to sign our book for the library.
Fantastic.
Okay. Thank you, Bjarke. So there's a reception down below. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Bjarke.